So a good question about like, why would you need to identify shrubs in winter? It's a lot easier to do it in the spring when they're leafed out and you can see their flowers and things like that. And the main reason that we try to train people about this is because they can take live stakes or cuttings in the winter and propagate plants using those cuttings. So this really is just taking a stem cutting and sticking it in the ground, and it grows into a new shrub. And there's quite a few of our native shrubs that have this ability. And so when you want to be collecting them, as in the winter, you can still identify your shrubs in the spring when it's a lot easier, and then come back and collect from them in the winter. But it's always good to have this skill. And I'm really just going to focus on the shrubs that have this ability. So we're not going to go over identifying like every possible native shrub in the Willamette Valley. So we have about 40 minutes probably that I'll be talking, and we're going to go over some resources that are available, and we'll go over identification tips for the different species that have this rooting ability. And then I'll just talk kind of briefly about taking cuttings and installing cuttings. This is one of the sheets that Becky will be sending out to people, and it's something that we put together to help people make decisions about if they want to try propagating their own shrubs or if they just want to focus on buying them. And so you'll be receiving this, so don't worry about trying to like memorize it all right now. The most important things to look at on this in relation to this presentation are the shrubs that root from what we call live stakes, the ones that say LS. Those are the ones that are successful from just putting a stick in the ground. But we also cover which ones are best to buy bare root, which ones you would want to buy from like a gallon container. And we did, one time we had a presentation where we talked about, for people who wanted to grow their own shrubs from seeds, which ones were pretty easy for people to do. So we had that on the list also. This tech note was something that we wrote many years ago, and it has a what we call a literature review, where we looked at all the literature out there that talked about all the propagation methods for native trees and shrubs in our area. We also had done a lot of our own work too with different types of cuttings and stuff, and that's also in this tech note. And a link to this tech note, it will be on the resource list that Becky said. But it's a really great overview of all the known propagation methods for the different native trees and shrubs in our area. So this is basically the list of the shrubs that we're going to be talking about today. They have different abilities of rooting, and willows and the black cottonwood are known to be the most successful. But I also find that the ones that are in this good category, the rhodosier dogwood, Pacific ninebark, spirea, twinberry honeysuckle, and common snowberry do really well. They're not 100% like the willows, but they're very reliable. And then this last group, the mock orange, salmonberry, elderberry, Indian plum, or I'll be referring to osaberry in this presentation, and red flowering currant. I've grown them and had really high success, but I've also had times where I've done it and it didn't do well. So they're just a little bit less reliable. So the best place to start when we're talking about identification is that we have to go over some basic botanical terms here. An easy thing to focus on in the winter are buds. So there's two types of buds on a twig. The one that's at the end of a branch is called a terminal bud. And sometimes there's a cluster of buds there, or sometimes there's just one. Either way, it's called a terminal bud. And then on the sides of the branch, you have lateral buds. Other things you might see on the stem that can be helpful for identification are these little pores called lenticels. Sometimes they're raised, sometimes they're different colors, but they're pretty distinct between the different species. There's also rings from previous year's bud scales that can not only determine age classes, but can be an identification tool too. And leaf scars, which are a place where a leaf was attached in the prior year, but now you will just have this little scar left. And some of the shrubs on their leaf scars are really big, and you can see remnants of the vascular system. And that's kind of high level. They're hard to see. I usually don't use those for identification tools, but they do work. And for people who are really into it, they can rely on that. The other thing that I rely on with a few of our species is looking at the pith. And so if you were to cut your stem in half and look at the center of it, that's where it's called the pith. The color of it or the shape of it and some other characteristics of it can be really helpful in identification. Some other things that are really helpful are the bud arrangement. And this is really like how the different leaves and stems will come off of a stem. And this is kind of a basic thing for even just regular plant ID, is whether it's what they call alternate, and that's how they come off at different places, or opposite, or they come off at the same place. And then zigzag really is alternate, but in the case of salmonberry, it does have this distinct zigzag pattern, so it makes it pretty easy to identify. In general, the size of a stem is important, whether it's very, very slender, like a snowberry, versus a willow, which is a lot more stout. And like I mentioned before with the pith, they can kind of be different shaped. Like you can have a chambered pith, like in the case of osoberry. Most of them are solid. I don't think I've ever come across one that has a star-shaped pith. That sounds very interesting, but it's not anyone that I've ever seen. And then again, like we talked about, the buds, the terminal buds and lateral buds, and the clustered buds there at the end. Bud scales also can be a really good identifying characteristic, especially in the case of willows, or even just the color of the bud scales, the arrangement of them. They become very distinct for different species. A lot of the stuff on this slide are things that I already covered, but this slide is really focusing on how you would determine the age of a twig or a branch. And why that's important is because a lot of times when you're taking cuttings for live staking, you want to take prior year's growth or only maybe 2-year-old growth. The young, vigorous tissue is more able to be flexible in turning from stem tissue to root tissue, or stem tissue to leaf tissue. So the age of the wood is important. And the best way to determine how old a stem is by looking for the leaf scar, or it's a band that runs around the whole branch, and it's basically the scar from where the terminal bud was last year. And so that can help you determine how old some of these things are. And it's usually at a place where there is a branch. And I find the bark is often different too. Like younger growth will be brightly colored. The bark will be smooth. It won't be as ragged. There won't be moss. There won't be lichens. It's just kind of young and bright. These aren't really something you would use for identification, but they're helpful in thinking about where you would take cuttings on an existing plant. So suckers grow up from the base, and sometimes you find them if a plant has fallen over or if it's been cut back. And then water sprouts, you'll notice them on, even if you've pruned your apple tree or your cherry trees, sometimes on those main branches, there'll be all of these little suckers that shoot off of it. So now we'll move more into the identification portion, and I have this handout that Becky will be sending you guys. So everything I'm covering in these slides, you don't have to try to write down. It's all nicely put together in this sheet that you guys will be getting. So just focus on the presentation and don't worry about trying to vigorously write everything down. Like I said, willows are one of the most common shrubs that people use for this type of work, with the live staking. Unfortunately, willows are incredibly difficult to identify to species because you'll need the male parts and the female parts, and I am pretty good at plant ID, and I don't even really attempt to identify willows unless there's a few common ones in the valley that I know. So I suggest to people that if they want to take willow cuttings for a specific project, that they try to focus on matching the willows that they find in the wild to the same habitat type that they want to be planting in. And this seems to be a good technique rather than trying to identify your willow species. They're usually small to large trees. They're multi-stemmed. They're not like having a single trunk. They often are grown in wet areas, and a lot of them do sucker. So they don't just have a central base, they actually come up, sending up new shoots all over the place. The easiest identification technique for the willows is this single bud scale or cap. It's just, and it's big, about this time of year, some of the willows that are on our farm look like this more yellowish one where they're starting to bloom. So even in February, you'll see really large buds on willows, and they have this big single cap on them, which is pretty easy to see when you have them in hand. Black cottonwood is also a really wonderful tree to establish from cuttings, but it's very large. So if this is something that you're considering, you have to have a place that can handle having a really large tree like this. And for the purpose of today's presentation, I'm not comparing black cottonwood ID to the other trees that would be of the same size. So this isn't going to encompass everything about how you would tell a black cottonwood from the other trees that would look like it. But once you're really up close on the stems of it, these things become a really good identification characteristic. They have these alternate conical and elongate buds, like they're pretty long and pointy. And the younger stems will have these vertical ridges. And this will be more noticeable on some of the parts of the plant than others. You can see in the other, where the yellow arrow is, that's pointing to a vertical ridge, but the other picture, that one looks more rounded. So it is on younger things. Other things I've noticed about this shrub or tree, that if you squeeze the buds, there can be resin inside, and it has this sweet smell that I always kind of associate with spring for some reason. And so that can be another characteristic of this tree. Rhodosier dogwood is an open, more rounded, multi-stemmed shrub, approximately 7 to 10 feet tall. It usually grows in riparian areas. And from far away, the shrubs will look very red on the outer tips of the shrub. And when you get up close, the things that I look for are, again, like the red stems become pretty diagnostic, but they also have these incredibly small, very pointed, slender buds that are opposite and pressed up against the stem. The lenticels are really apparent on this shrub also. They look like little white specks all over it. And when you look at them, they do look like little white pores. And I use that too. If I ever see another reddish type shrub, I will look for these lenticels to make sure that it is this plant. And the lenticels show up even when the stems are still kind of green, because sometimes the growth on the tree or like lower on the base will be more brownish or greenish, but you can still see these lenticels. Pacific ninebark is it's a medium-sized shrub. This tends to grow kind of like compact and upright. It has a central base with multiple stems. Some of my favorite things to look for on a shrub, if I'm confused about what it is I look for last year's fruits, essentially. Like anywhere you can find remnants of what the seed head was or the berries, that can be really helpful. And this is a similar technique that we use a lot with conifers if you look for cones and things like that. So the fruiting structures are often really distinct for that plant. So ninebark is one of those that in an older shrub, they have lots of these fruiting structures that remain throughout the winter. And when you walk up, you can instantly see it. this plant also has pretty distinct bark. The only other shrub I can think of that has bark like this is ocean spray. And there's also an inset with the red letters there and the red arrow that point to what an ocean spray fruiting structure looks like. So those two things look really different. So between the bark and those fruiting structures, those can narrow down to 9 bark pretty easily. And they have alternate buds. Like I said, this peeling bark, and yeah, mostly the flower structure, the fruiting structures are what help identify this one in the winter. Douglas spirea is considered a shrub because it's woody, but it tends to have a different growth pattern than a lot of shrubs. It's more of what I would call it's right in between being a cane and a shrub. It does have so many suckers that pop up all over the place that it will create these dense monocultures, but it's very beautiful. It can be, usually I'd say it's around 4 to 7 feet tall. This thing here lists 12 feet, which is pretty tall. Nothing is super distinct on just the stems of this plant. So again, looking for the old flower heads, the seed heads that stick up on all the stems is really the easiest way to identify this plant. It's distinct. It only looks like this plant. But if you, let's just say if you just, all you had to go off of was a cutting, like someone took a bunch of cuttings and mixed them up. This plant has really tiny buds with these little tiny white hairs. And this is something that when you see it in person, it's really obvious, but it's kind of hard to see it on a presentation. So yeah, the buds aren't big at all, but they have these white hairs that make them distinct. So using that and then the last year's flower heads become the best identification tool for this one. Black twinberry is a small to medium shrub, and it kind of has like a little bit more of a scraggly arched form to it. And I've noticed that when I see them in high elevation areas, they're a little smaller and compact. Like I've seen little ones at Crater Lake that are like 3 feet tall. Here in the valley, they do have a little bit more of a fewer, longer stems rather than a nice compact bush. I think some of the hardest ones to tell apart are the twinberry, mock orange, and snowberry. And they all have opposite buds. They all can be sort of like gray to brown, and nothing super, super distinct. And so it's kind of a combination of characteristics that help identify it. With the twinberry, looking at, you can see the inset picture of the buds. They look brown and dead. They don't look living at all, which is kind of unique for a shrub. So those little dead looking buds are a good indicator. And the twigs are a little bit more angled. So if you were to cut them in half and look at them, there's more angles to them and they're not perfectly round. And again, if you have any fruiting structures left on a plant, that can really help. The growth pattern of snowberry and the fact that the berries remain make snowberry pretty easy to identify. It's a little bit like spirea in a way that it can take on different forms and do this painting thing where it can create thickets and monocultures. And snowberry can also look kind of vining and run on the ground. It's a highly variable species, but it's not very tall. And it doesn't look like a compact, like multi-stemmed shrub. And like I said, the berries become super obvious with this plant. You're not gonna, if there are berries on your snowberry, you're not going to confuse it with anything else. But if you just had stems and none of the berries, it can, like I said, look like twinberry or mock orange. But the pith on this one is distinct from the other two. The pith on this one is dark, right, or hollow, where the other two have, it's still white, like it's not dark. So that becomes I think, something that if you don't have berries, looking at the pith is my number one ID tool. And then mock orange. If you ever come across these in flower, you're not gonna mistake them for anything else. Nothing has like as showy of flowers as this shrub. It can be kind of tall, and it can resemble more of a tree in some areas. And it's multi-stemmed. It is like a shrub. And it has those, like I was saying, the inconspicuous opposite buds like snowberry and twinberry, but it has a whitish pith, so that separates it from snowberry. I also think that on this, the leaf scars are really apparent. You don't notice them on the other two as much. And this is more of like a grayish chocolate brown. But I think that there is this sort of like repeating pattern of the leaf scars that also make it look pretty distinct. And the buds don't look all shriveled up and dead. You can't even really see the buds on this one, and that can separate it from the twinberry. And like I said, the twinberry is more angled in cross section, where the mock orange is perfectly round. Red elderberry can kind of take on a shrub form, or it can be in a tree form. They can get pretty tall. They have these large cane-like stems that can come up from the base, and usually you'll find it in a place where there's some level of moisture. It's important to be able to tell red elderberry from blue elderberry if you want to take cuttings, because blue elderberry is not successful from just sticking a cutting in the ground, but red elderberry does okay. And again, using the past fruiting structures as an ID tool, this is a pretty easy way to tell these apart, because the red elderberry will have conical flowers. They'll be more like shaped like an ice cream cone, where the blue elderberry has flat tops. They'll look like an upside down umbrella. That helps tell the two apart, either in the flowering stage or if you can find those structures in the winter. The other thing is red elderberry has really big egg-shaped buds, and we'll see pictures of that here. So you can see the inset of the blue elderberry buds, and they're a little bit more pointy, versus the red elderberry. That's the one that has the yellow circle and the yellow arrow pointing to those big egg-shaped buds. And these are really big. They're big stems, they're big buds, they're very noticeable. I've also read that these leaf scars, like I talked about in the terminology intro about the leaf scars, and you can see parts of the vascular system. And supposedly red has 3 bundle scars and blue has 5. You can see it. It is apparent. It's just not, I haven't needed this as an ID tool. Usually you can use these other things. Salmonberry is a shrub, but it's definitely what I would call a cane. It suckers, it sends up lots of suckers all over the place. It can grow tall, especially in areas that are shaded and have a lot of moisture. I have seen it create really dense thickets. In terms of ID, there's not a lot to confuse it with. It does have this zigzag pattern. It has thorns and weakly attached. They do come off pretty easily. And like I said, it's a suckering shrub, so you have like all of these suckers coming up all over the place. And yeah, I don't think there's a lot that we confuse this one with. Osoberry is a multi-stem shrub, kind of a small tree. It can look a little bit like a tree. Again, found in like kind of shady places with some moisture. This is the one that has the pith that becomes a good ID tool. So if you cut the stem kind of in half, so you can get a good view of the pith, it has these chambers. Basically, it has all these little lines inside of it that make it really easy to tell, like for sure this is oso berry. The only one I can get confused with is with red flowering currant. There are times in the winter that they can look a little similar because they kind of have a little bit reddish bark and their buds swell early, because they're both just about to start blooming. So those two can, without a lot of looking at them closely, from afar, I can get those two confused. But if I ever have any doubt, I can always look at that pith, which helps me tell them apart. And they do smell different, but this is one of those things, like when I try to describe to people how things smell, it's like you kind of have to know the smell in order to be able to use it as an ID tool. But they do, on the oso berry, if you squish the buds, and I think the leaves too, there is this cucumber, this kind of like this fresh, moist smell to them that is pretty distinct. And my notes say that the bud scales are more layered and rounded. And that's true, we can see it in the next picture, but I tend to use the pith and the smell as a way to distinguish it. Most people know and love red flowering currant. It is a beautiful shrub, and it's compact. It's just an all-around great shrub. And so most people ID it, they just know where they are because they're really, really showy. But if you ever were trying to find it in the winter, the buds, you can see the buds here, and think back to that previous slide. The buds to me look different. These ones are a little bit more pointy, and they can sometimes come off at these like spurs in a way. And like this slide says too, about if you can look for the fruiting structures from the prior year, that's really helpful in IDing it. But the smell of the oso berry and the chambered pith can help distinguish it from this one. Anything else? Yeah. I saw some yesterday that were just starting to have the little green leaves that peek out of the buds, so it's starting. I include poison oak not because I would suggest collecting it. I include this to warn people that even if we're not seeing poison oak, it's still there, and some people can still have a reaction to it if they're just around the wood. So this is something I've been throwing into this presentation just to help people like kind of be thinking about it and realize that it's still out there. The fact that the twigs branch out at these kind of distinct 45-degree angles off the branches become a good thing to look for. And then the dark black leaf scars at the base of those junctions become pretty helpful. And these two ID tools are really apparent on poison oak that's been cut back and regrew. It's harder to see this on like little tiny stems all over the place, or when it's binding up a tree. But some of those are easy to tell if they're poison oak anyway. But I have seen people go up to what looks like a really wonderful shrub to take cuttings from and realize that it's poison oak that's been cut back and it has this regrowth. So just keep an eye out for those things. And if you see that, I don't recommend taking cuttings. So that wraps up the identification part of it. And I thought we would just spend a little bit more time talking about cuttings a little bit, because that's sort of, the purpose of why you would be wanting using this ID stuff. And if cuttings really are a wonderful way to get a lot more plants on your property for zero cost or just your time, and they're pretty successful, and it's pretty easy to do. So some people are like, well, where would I get cuttings? And so of course these shrubs exist naturally, they exist in people's landscapes. So trying to find, private land holdings that have it, like asking your neighbors or friends or timber companies or ask around, and it's really important you get permission, obviously. And some places on public land you can also take cuttings from, and a lot of the federal agencies allow this. There's free collection permits. You just need to check in with them and explain how much you're going to take, and they can be really helpful on allowing this on their property. A lot more of the conservation district native plant sales are starting to carry cuttings, as well as native plant nurseries. So these are becoming more available for purchase also, because they are really easy. Even just planting it, is a lot easier than having to dig holes for bare root or a container plant. Two other resources that are on my list that I didn't talk about right now, or I didn't talk about earlier, are the Washington Native Plant Society has a winter twig ID key that's on the web. It's pretty good. It can get you pretty close. It won't always pick out just the right shrub for you, and you have to be able to see all the things it's asking you about in the key. But it's pretty good. It could get you, either to the right one or within a range of 3, and it's kind of fun to do. There's also a book put out by the Washington State University Cooperative Extension Service called Winter in the Woods: A Western Guide to Deciduous Native Plants in Western Washington, and that goes over all of them, not just what I've covered. So if you're really interested in being able to do this, that's a wonderful book. Now we'll go over a little bit about how you would go about taking cuttings and sticking cuttings. And I always like to say it is as easy as putting a stick in the ground. So before you cut, you would want to be looking out for vigorous, healthy plants, ideally ones that have been cut back in the previous 2 or 3 years, because once the shrubs are cut back, they'll resprout and create these really nice suckers and cuttings that are very straight. They're vigorous. They're all 1 year old. There's no branches coming off of them. And at the Plant Material Center where I work, we actually have little shrub blocks essentially that we maintain for the purpose of taking cuttings. And some of the cuttings are just for our own personal use because we're doing studies with them. And sometimes we're able to open it up to landowners and people who are working with the SWCDs and the NRCS, so they can come and take their own cuttings too. So if that's something you're interested in, you can talk with Becky or Jenny Measle about it, and they can put you in contact with me too if you want to come take some cuttings from our shrub blocks that have been maintained in this way. So the straight growth is really important, mostly for just being able to stick them in the ground. It's a lot easier if they're straight. And the young, kind of what I talked about before, the young stem material on these shrubs are where they're going to have the most flexibility to change from being a stem cell into a root cell or a leaf cell. So having plants that have been cut back creates that perfect growth for taking cuttings from. And even shrubs that haven't been cut back will still have these really nice suckers and stuff, but sometimes they're internal and there's not as many of them, but you can still find them. So one of the reasons that we do this, like I said, we do this training in the winter is because you want to be taking these cuttings in the winter because they're called hardwood cuttings. They're dormant hardwood cuttings. So you want to take them after leaf fall, but before the new shoots emerge in the spring. So this is usually like November to February is the best time to be doing this. And I always think that the earlier you plant, the earlier you get your cuttings in the ground, the more root growth can happen. So some of these shrubs, as soon as you put them in the ground, the weather's great and it's nice enough for them to keep creating roots in the winter, even though it's pretty cold. Some of them needed to be a little bit warm, but there's no reason not to have them in the ground earlier because they'll just start growing their roots when the conditions are right. But I understand that a lot of the material isn't available until February, and sometimes people can't really get into their site until later in February. So February is still a fine time to do it. And thinking about this process, it's really focused on roots. So the more roots that you grow, the higher success rate your shrubs are going to have. And even thinking about into perpetuity, more roots will equal a bigger plant in the future. And they will be able to withstand the summer drought better if they have more roots, because usually their roots are down deeper. So the ideal cuttings for the bigger shrubs like the willows and the cottonwoods, they can be pretty large, but you'd like them to be straight with no side branches, which is pretty easy to find. I make my cuttings 3 feet long, and I tell people approximately the diameter of your thumb, and the tip should be no smaller than your pinky. I kind of have small hands, so that's not always the best. So if you want numbers, we have found that the highest survival and cover after 3 years came from material that had a diameter of 3/4 to 1 inch. So it's pretty big, but it's easy to find on willows, and they do really well. And people even plant 3-inch diameter willow poles, which that can be really hard to plant, but I've seen it in some big soil bioengineering projects and stuff. So I would say, yeah, this 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch is a really good size for these bigger shrubs. Then you get into the smaller ones, and a lot of this is kind of repetitive. So I'm just focusing on diameter. So rhodosia dogwood, you can do 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch to 1 inch, and that's a great diameter. When you get to the 9-bark and the twinberry, it can be harder to find a 1/2 inch, but anything 1/4 inch and up is great. And in 9-bark, we found that the age class, it did matter a little bit. The highest rooting ability came from the 2- and 3-year-old wood on that one. Again, if you can get a 3-foot long cutting, I think that's ideal. When you talk about snowberry, it's really hard to find one that's thick enough and 3 feet long. So if you can get a 1/4 inch cutting, that's perfect on a snowberry. But if it's only 18 inches long, that's also going to be really good. Spirea can be thin, but they can be really long. But so if you can't get a 3-foot cutting out of a spirea, you can also do 18 inches. They'll work just fine. Red elderberry is tricky because you have to get a certain set of nodes in your cutting. So if you were focusing on trying to get a 3-foot cutting, you would want to have 3 sets of nodes. And the node is the place where those buds are. And because on this shrub, the only place where it's going to either make new roots or new leaves is at a node. And so you really want to have 2 sets of those nodes under the ground. And then you want to have another set of nodes above the ground, because that's what's going to turn into leaves. So sometimes on the red elderberry, the nodes are really far apart. They're over a foot apart on some of them. And so it can be tricky on that one, but that's where you want to focus on, not so much the actual length as it is the number of nodes. And it's usually pretty easy to find cuttings that are a 1/2 inch in diameter. Osoberry and mock orange and salmonberry, they're on the thinner side, and so 1/4 inch is fine on those two. And we found that the younger salmonberry is better than older. So if you get ones that are 1 to 2 years, we had a lot more success with that than ones that were 3 years old. And the 3-year-old one looks it looks older. Like you can tell they tend to have lichens or moss growing on them, and the bark is really dark. And here's just some tips, mostly from mistakes that we've made in the past, so that it's really important to keep track of the top and bottom ends after you've made your cuttings, because they just look like a bunch of sticks. So we always cut our tops flat and we cut our bottom angled. So even if someone drops all the sticks, you can always tell what's up and down. And it does make it a little easier with an angled bottom to get them into the ground. And if you're having a lot of people help you and you want to keep track of the species and not sure how to do that, like you can color code things with tape or putting a little paint on them. And that also can help you figure out the tops and the bottoms too. Handling your cuttings is really important. They are alive, and it's important that they stay cool and moist. And I know that people can't always plant their cuttings immediately. And so I always tell them that if you can wrap them in wet towels, wet paper towels, and put them in a plastic bag and have them somewhere cold. We have a walk-in cooler, so we just wrap them up in wet towels in a plastic bag and we put them in our cooler. And they're fine in there for a couple weeks. I don't like to go much beyond that. And so if you can't get to planting yours, putting them in a cold spot in the garage or just somewhere out of direct sunlight and someplace where they're going to stay cool and moist is really important. So for planting them, the most important thing is that you get 2/3 of the length in the ground. So if you have a 3-foot cutting, you want 2 feet in the ground. And no matter what happens, like even if I've put cuttings in and it just won't go it won't go 2 feet. It just will not happen. Then I just adjust the ratio and I cut the top off to make it shorter so that I have that proper ratio. And really it's just to make sure that you want 2/3 of that stem in the ground. So 2/3 of that stem is growing roots and only 1/3 of it is growing leaves. Because if you have a lot of leaves and only a little bit of roots, your shrub is not going to make it. So you can adjust that ratio. So even if you have that's what I was saying, even if you have an 18-inch long cutting and you put it in the ground, it's fine. You just want to have 2/3 of it in. Or if you're starting to place one and you hit a rock and you can't get it any farther in, you can just cut the top to make that ratio work out. You might need to drill some pilot holes, especially with some of the bigger willows and things like that. You can use rebar or steel rods and just like make a hole and then put your cutting in it. You don't want to have like a really big hole and a small stick in there because it'll create a lot of air pockets in it and it won't root really well. If your cuttings are really thick and very rigid, you can use like hammers, like a mallet, and just simply pound the stake into the ground. This works with really stout material. And just a couple tips after you plant. Applying mulch is great. It helps suppress weeds. It helps hold in moisture. It's really great. Keep weeds away from your shrubs and keep them from competing and going to seed. And I recommend irrigating the first year for sure, and second year depending on what kind of year we've had. But after that, the shrubs do great and they live a long time. And I find this to be a super great method just to get a lot of shrubs established. And with that, one more. Deer, voles, rabbits, they can eat your shrubs and girdle things. So if you know you have a problem with these animals, consider protection methods like fencing, repellents, or tree guards, or hardware cloth, or even these blue tubes or the little mesh ones there. Okay, and that's all I had, and I think now we can move into questions.
If you have any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask Amy yourself. Jenny, go ahead.
Hey everybody, I just put a comment in the chat that Marion SWCD does have rebar planters that you can borrow and check out from our office. They're pretty handy. They have steps on them and they have a rebar, they have handles and a step that you can use to push down. And I think the rebar is about a foot, goes down about a foot. So that can help with planting and getting stuff in the ground. If you're interested, just contact our office and you can stop by and pick them up. That's all I had. Thanks, Amy.
Great, thank you. We do have a question in the chat. Actually, we might have a couple now. Is rooting hormone needed?
For these, no. No, and for a few of them, we've actually seen it decrease rooting. So with these ones, we do not recommend it.
All right, do we have any other questions? Okay, well, thank you, Amy, for presenting to us today. I know that with the longer days coming, and especially hearing presentations like this, it gets me excited to go out and do things. So I just wish I had more plants on my property to go and really look and see what there is to take some cuttings from. We do have some more questions coming into the chat, I believe. So, oh, how long should we wait to repot?
Well, I was mostly talking about putting these plants just directly in the ground. If you did put them in pots, I would say like once they've become root bound in the pot, you would want to put them in a different pot, and you would want to plan putting your pots in the ground around when we have ample rain. So if you took your cuttings in the winter and they filled out their pot in June, that would not be a time you want to put your potted plant in the ground. You would want to, I would suggest taking care of it in the pot throughout the summer, or putting it in a bigger pot through the summer and then planting that in the fall. So hopefully that answered the question.
Let's see here. We do have either for you or maybe for Jenny also, if the smoke trees that Heritage Farms has growing up along Highway 22, did they top those trees to encourage extra branching to obtain cuttings?
Is there a power line above them, Janice? They might have done it for a power line or for something like that. Not sure. I don't know if you can take cuttings from smoke bush.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
And
Janice
it could have
just
just
commented.
been, it could have been maintenance if they were getting kind of leggy and they just wanted to cut them down to make them branch out more or bloom more.
Yeah, Janice said in a follow-up comment talking about how now they got a lot bushier since they've been cut back. Great. Okay, well, it doesn't look like there are any further questions. So once again, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Amy, for your presentation today. And I'll be following up with an email either later this afternoon or early next week with some additional information from Amy. And once again, thank you all for joining us.